Commercial airplane pilots. What's the closest disaster you've averted while on a flight that the passengers had no idea about? How often do these things happen? I'm a commercial airline captain on a newish Embraer 175. Probably one of the scarier things I've had happen was when one of our cabin pressure control channels failed and we started to rapidly lose pressurization. Pressurization is important because the air is so thin in the flight levels, specifically above 30,000 feet. The higher up you get, the less time of useful consciousness you have, down to about 30 seconds. So it's a pretty scary thought that's a problem requiring immediate action, usually a steep emergency descent, during which you will not hear from the pilots because we are super busy. Our pressure controller has two channels and automatically switches to the second if one fails. We were flying along about to start our descent and briefing our arrival, and our ears started popping like mad. I looked over and the pressurization was climbing very fast. We started a steep but not quite emergency descent, while I flipped the pressurization switch to manual and then back to auto. This manually switched the channel to the working one and we could continue without problem. Pretty sure all the passengers noticed their ears were popping. It gave us about 80 seconds of a scare though. The funniest part was that when we landed, our maintenance control wanted us to defer the pressurization channel over the phone, meaning we'll fix it later. Generally a very safe way to get flights out on time with something minor or redundant broken. I told him I was going to have to insist that someone come over and actually look at the plane to say it was safe to fly. Edit. I'd like to add that the mechanics were not being reckless. These channels rarely fail, and having two is already a redundancy. They're absolutely able to defer them with very little concern or safety. I was being overly cautious in my request for an inspection, and they accommodated me without question. A few mechanics out there must have very charged relationships with pilots. This is rarely the case in my workplace. So this reminds me of like anyone that's ever been in a car accident before and like your first time back out on the road after that accident, you're just like kind of gun shy and overly paranoid. This is kind of like the same thing. It's like, yeah, I know there's probably nothing wrong with the plane, but like after the experience that we just had, I need to be absolutely certain that this plane is safe to fly before I go up there again. So totally understand. Story 2. When I was in the Air Force, we had the 4-inch drop fix. If a piece of equipment wasn't working right, we'd lift it up 4 inches and drop it, then plug it back in and see if that worked. It was about 50-50. Was great for fixing stuck relays. If it didn't work, we'd pull it and replace it. Granted, I worked on electronic warfare equipment. None of our equipment affected the safety of the plane's operation. I hope the guys working on the actual flight systems were at least a little more diligent with their repairs. Story 3. Half the passengers in this story had no idea, while the other half likely crapped themselves. My father was a captain for Eastern Airlines and told a story about almost being at takeoff speed when another commercial jet taxied across his runway. He was going too fast to abort, so he had to pull up early and clear the other plane by feet. I don't remember the exact amount. His passengers had no idea, but the other plane's passengers saw everything. I don't know what ended up happening to the other pilot, but my dad got an apology call from him that evening. Story 4. Yay, story time. I'm an air traffic controller, for the record. Had a pilot go Nordo. That's when, for whatever reason, they aren't on my frequency anymore. They didn't get the right one, misheard, or their radios crapped out. It happens fairly often, and there are a number of things we can do to get you back in the right place. This particular guy, however, went Nordo at precisely the worst time. He was going eastbound, which means he was at an odd altitude. He lost his radio, and his flight plan then had him turn southbound. That means he was supposed to be at an even altitude, which he obviously wasn't. There were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude, so he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet, going through all these people as I was descending and climbing them to get them out of his way. Then, apparently, in an act of sheer ignorance on the pilot's part, he decided to choose an even altitude all by himself, knowing he should probably be at one. Remember all those planes I had to move out of his way? He managed to put himself right back into them. When you have closure rates of over 1,000 knots an hour, that's not a lot of time to react to those things. At the end, my a-hole was clenched so tight that when I stood up, the seat came with me. Edit. Guys, for the love of God, I've answered it 7 times now, if you'll just read before posting. I freaking know it's just knots, not knots per hour. Not everyone is familiar with the lingo, so I said it that way to make it easier. Give it a rest. Story 5. Not a pilot, but I am an air traffic controller and have had my fair share of near collisions. Less than a week after I got certified, I had the closest call of my career. It was the end of a swing shift on a Friday night with just myself and my watch supervisor. We were waiting for a formation flight to come in and land for the night. Near the end of the shift, we received inbound information on them, and a few minutes later, they tagged up on radar, marked overhead, landing maneuver, and full stop. For those who don't know, an overhead maneuver is a type of tactical approach very common in the military. It's basically a descending 360-degree turn that starts over the approach end of the runway at an altitude of 1500 to 2000 AGL and is complete when the aircraft is established on final. Anyway, the formation was 4-mile initial for the overhead when approach control called up with a medevac helo 15 miles north eastbound with a critical casualty requesting transition through our airspace. Given the relation of my two aircraft in the position of the helo, I told the approach controller, transition approved, you guys can keep them, on comms. Our aircraft are going to be on the ground in a minute. My aircraft began their tactical maneuver to land, and I gave them their landing clearance. Not worried about the situation, I turned around and chatted with my supervisor about what we were doing that weekend. I glanced over him. The first aircraft was turning his base leg to land and assumed the second aircraft behind him would do so as well shortly. Our conversation ended abruptly by the sound of our radar's PCAS alarm, alerting us that a collision was imminent. I looked at the radar, and the second aircraft and the helo were nose to nose, less than 1 mile apart, at the same altitude. I keyed up and gave a traffic alert, to which I received a short pause, followed by a calm, "We see 'em." The targets passed over one another with the indication of the same altitude, which means they came within 100 feet of one another. TLDR, approved a helo transition with two C-130s performing an overhead maneuver. The second aircraft flew out much further than anticipated before turning its base leg. I wasn't aware until the collision arm rang, and I gave a last-minute traffic alert with the aircraft nose to nose, opposite direction, less than 1 mile apart at the same altitude. What happened? I learned 3 things from this incident. First and foremost, never get distracted in side chatter when you have aircraft you're responsible for. The formation in the overhead. The first aircraft conducted the maneuver as published. The second aircraft made a 180-degree turn, flew 5 miles, and then made a second 180 before descending, which is not typical. Anticipate aircraft not conducting the maneuvers as usual. The medevac helo was going much faster than I anticipated. Typically, these helos fly around 80 to 90 knots. This helo was traveling at about 140 knots, so I anticipated the aircraft not being as close as he was. Always look at the airspeed of a transition. I worked at a very busy training base, and incidents were fairly common, typically 2 to 3 a month. It depends on what you would consider an incident. Due to the nature of the traffic flow, we had separation busts all the time, IFR versus IFR. However, we would very easily fix this with various turns and other procedures. Edit. Those not familiar with swing shift, it was nighttime. Also, the helo did not have his lights on and could not be seen. Also, I did not expect this post to blow up the way it did. I hope some people learn from my screw-up. Story 6. Airline pilots generally inform passengers on a need-to-know basis. There's a malfunction the passengers can't see, hear, or smell, and if it doesn't have an immediate effect on the flight, it's best not to tell anything, as it can only cause panic. 1. The closest I've come to a disaster was almost a decade ago when, during cruise, the thrust reverser suddenly unlocked on engine 2. This was one of those near hypothetical failures we trained for in the simulator, but you'd never expect to see in real life. We immediately pulled that engine back to idle because should it fully deploy on cruise power, the resulting yaw motion could easily cause structural damage. Lauda 004 and TAM 402. Playing with the throttle, we found that the thrust reverser unlocked warning only appeared at a high power setting. After a short consult with maintenance, we decided to leave engine number 2 running at low power, allowing us to continue the flight to our destination, while not being at risk to overstress the airframe should it deploy. Shutting the engine down completely would have meant we had to divert to an alternate airport because the remaining engine can't provide enough power to generate the electricity, pressurization, and thrust required to continue our destination at cruising altitude. Passengers may have noticed a reduction in engine noise from the right-hand side of the aircraft and a slight delay, but apart from that, there was nothing that could indicate something was amiss. 2. Piloting a small aircraft for a sightseeing flight with 3 passengers, I once experienced an engine failure. This was partly self-inflicted and a valuable learning experience. 5 minutes in the flight, I saw the right fuel tank was empty. Because I've looked in the tanks before departure, and as indicators are far from reliable, I suspected instrument failure over a fuel leak. Letting go of the controls, the aircraft flew straight and level as you'd expect when having 2 equally filled tanks. Still, I'd rather be safe than sorry, so I decided to lean the fuel/air mixture a bit to optimize fuel economy. Generally, the fuel mixture in an aircraft's position engine has a bit more fuel than required for combustion. The evaporated non-combusted fuel cools the engine from the inside. Keeping an eye on the engine temperature, I started reducing the mixture when suddenly the engine stopped. The aircraft went completely silent and started to glide. Pushing the nose a bit to keep the propeller windmilling, I applied the emergency checklist from memory, and the engine roared back to life at full mixture. I told my passengers I had to shift gear, while they remained completely oblivious about what just happened. Back on the ground, we found that one of the two magnetos providing electricity to the spark plugs had failed. Story 7. I used to fly vintage biplanes and take people up on joyrides effectively. We would do aerobatics, let them fly it for a bit, and come back for tea and medals. We also did air displays and we did wing walking, although my DA didn't allow me to do those. While it's not your typical airline passenger transport, it is still commercial flying. As these aircraft were built in the 30s and 40s, there were several times where the crap was hitting the fan, and as the cockpits are separate, they were blissfully unaware. Always was a chuckle at the end having to explain that what just happened wasn't normal. Some good examples. Engine exploded during flight. Big end failure, blew a hole in crankcase, landed in a field. Passenger was French and just thought landing in a field was what we did at the end. He couldn't understand the mayday on the radio. Have some great photos of the engine afterwards if interested. Edit. We used to land on a grass runway. Had a tire blowout, one and only time. We must have stopped in about 50 meters. Normal run-on is about 200 meters-ish. Passenger had no idea until I had to get fire crew out to push aircraft back to the hangar, and he thought the whole thing was great. Of the many engine overhauls, one of the first 5 to 10 flights afterwards, flight was normal. We always did a bit of aerobatics as we were all qualified display pilots/aerobatic instructors. I come up to the top of the loop, start to pull the throttle back, and it goes loose in my hand. I'm stuck at 100% throttle. The stamped throttle linkage is designed to go flat out if the linkage snaps. It's counterweighted so gravity keeps it at 100%. Said nothing, quietly informed ATC I would need runways clear as I was going to dead stick it from overhead. Chopped the engine at 2,000 feet and just did a tight glide approach in. Luckily, it had a multi-tool, so I just jerry-rigged the throttle back once we had stopped. Started the engine, it had an air start, and taxied back and got it fixed properly. Most of the time, the passenger doesn't know what normal is, so it's no different for them when things go awry, assuming you get a safe landing out of it. Story 8. Regional airline pilot here. ATC, pilots, mechanics, and everyone else that works around planes makes mistakes multiple times a day. But there's something to be said about making so many mistakes you become a smoking hole in the ground. That's ridiculously hard to do. There's so much redundancy and layers of safety built in the airline environment. The last U.S. carrier crash with fatalities was Colgan Air back in 2009. There have been millions and millions of flights since then. Try to wrap your mind around how amazing that is. And it's not luck, it's the system we fly under. Story 9. Airline pilot, hence the throwaway account. I had a couple. My most recent one was in a holding pattern, and I was listening to ATC clearing another plane to land on the same runway in the opposite direction that another plane was taking off. Immediately went on the radio and informed the other planes about the conflict. The plane taking off aborted the takeoff, and the landing plane aborted the landing. Very quickly, another ATC took over from the one that goofed. Story 10. Not a pilot, but I was on a plane that had a near miss. We were flying to Chicago and about to land. Right when the landing gear would normally pop out, the plane shoots straight back up in the air. I looked at the flight attendants as they know what's normal and what's not. They looked scared crapless. I honestly thought it was a terrorist attack. We got back up to altitude and the pilot came over the intercom. He told us to stay buckled and it would be just a few more minutes. Still freaking out at this point, but in a little bit we actually did make a safe landing. Turns out, 2 planes were attempting to land at the same time and on the same runway. Very scary, but everyone was okay. Yeah, I think this is why, there's kind of that unwritten rule for flight attendants and pilots. Unless there is like an actual crisis that people need to know about, just don't say anything, because obviously something like that would be enough to send the entire plane into a frenzy. Story 11. I fly an older Dash 8. We have lots of little problems. Sometimes the nav system blanks out. Minor electrical issues. I fly in an area with non-precision ILS. Sometimes we only fly VFR approaches. I was landing on a small dirt strip on Baffin Island when a crosswind pushed the aircraft off the approach and we had just enough power to go around. If the plane was a little heavier, I may not be here to tell the story. Story 12. My padre is a wide-body pilot, and commercial aviation is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. To be honest, flying is pretty damn safe. In the last 50 years, we've fixed about every disastrous problem a plane can have. Really, the only thing left to worry about is pilot error, which itself is mitigated by the endless redundancies in technology and warning systems in the cockpit. Well, Russian rebels shooting you down can also put a damper on things. Also, if you choose to see the carnage that got us to where we are today, search for the Air Crash Investigation series on YouTube. Really great and entertaining documentary series of plane crashes that changed the game. Story 13. My friend was a co-pilot on a commercial flight I was on from Toronto to Los Angeles, and it was the scariest flight I've been on, and getting the co-pilot's perspective after the flight made it even scarier. The flight went very smoothly until we were making the descent into Los Angeles Airport, LAX, just after 10 p.m. I was looking out the window, and it seemed as if we were 20 meters from touching the runway when all the lights began to flicker and the plane went into complete darkness. Immediately, you could feel and hear the engines thunder into overdrive, and we pulled back up. Plane continued rising, and we began to circle the air in complete darkness as everyone begins to share concerns. The flight kept circling for about 20 minutes before the pilot came on, explaining they were having some technical problems, and they're discussing with the ATC to resolve the issue and make a safe landing. The circling in the air continued for nearly an hour, but it seemed like an eternity in pitch black. Lights never came on, and we were notified we were going to make an attempt to land. People say this all the time, but I can assure you, this was one crazy descent. The bumpiest descent I've ever been a part of. We were constantly being lifted from our seats, and seatbelt light really had merit this time. People were screaming each time, and I was actually holding onto the armrest, and we kept defying gravity and swaying left and right. When we saw the lights on the runway inch closer, the plane slammed onto the runway, and we once again heard the engines roaring as we slowed down on the runway. As we came to a stop, the plane just stayed there and waited on the runway for a tow to the docking area. You could feel the relief within the cabin. If everyone was sitting on toilets, I can assure you, each one would need a flush. After we arrived, I met with the co-pilot a few hours later, as we planned to meet for a day before he had to fly out of town. He explained they lost electrical power and had lost several forms of communication, and flight information was not available to the pilots. Ultimately, the pilots had to land the plane manually with nearly no assistance or outside help. Considering it was nighttime, poor visibility, and limited flight information available, this made for a very crappy landing. He admitted as well it was the scariest flight he's been on. Tops my list of moments I thought I was dead. So this may or may not be the case. Those with insight, please feel free to comment down below. But is there not any kind of training that pilots go through for landing without that technology? In the event that it goes out, can you land it? Do you know what to do manually without the help of radar, any kind of comms? I'm wondering, is that a thing or do you just have to wing it? Story 14. Not a commercial pilot, but a private. Almost had a mid-air collision with a quadcopter in my single-engine prop plane. Those dumbass quadcopter pilots are about to ruin it for everyone. Edit. People seem to think I'm an airline pilot. I'm not. I fly a tiny Cessna, one engine. Pilots don't want to hit birds, any size birds. Sometimes they bounce off, sometimes they leave a dent, and sometimes they go through the windshield, exploding inside the cockpit with blood and guts covering everything. Maybe that bird will even hit the pilot straight in the face. So you can see how pilots don't want to hit quadcopters that are made of plastic and metal. Edit 2. Some people seem to be defending the quadcopters hard. I don't give a crap about people flying them. But is it so much to ask for quadcopter pilots not to fly around real aircraft with real people inside? I'm not an airplane pilot. I don't fly effing big jets. I'm a little dinky airplane. F you if you're stupid enough to fly around the flight path of any airplane. I don't know why some people are justifying it by saying that planes can withstand birds before hobbyist drones. Story 15. Well, it was a two-seat Cessna and everyone involved knew what happened, but here we go. This was years ago, and I had taken the chance to fly back from Alaska to the lower 48 in a Cessna 150. This thing was basically a riding mower with wings. 17-year-old me thought that it would be fun to take longer flying the distance than driving it, which was true in terms of time, but that was because of storms that grounded us in BC for 2 days. We were flying into a regional airport in the north, name not given to protect the involved. It was a standard X-shaped two-runway affair with 3 controllers and a supervisor in the tower. We were on base approach, tooling along at about 75 mph and watching for other aircraft. Teen me is thrilled to see a pair of FA-18 Hornets from the Canadian Air Force also in the pattern. After the obligatory jokes about Canada has an Air Force, we concentrate on landing. Now, the 150 we were in has a stupidly short landing distance, so we're on the ground fast and just derping along to get to the taxiway. After 3 hours in this tiny plane, I take off the headset to try and get comfortable. Thus, I don't know what was said by the tower, but the pilot goes white as a sheet. OF. All of a sudden, we're turning around on the runway, which is not something that is ever supposed to happen. Confused and terrified, I start to ask what's going on when I look up. At a distance of too effing close are the Hornets, flaps and gear down, going right over us. They go to afterburner and go around as our Cessna putts over and parks. Dead silence in our cockpit. We stop, tie down everything, and stand there for a second. Pilot, are you okay? Yeah. Are you okay, Bronin? Yeah. Did that just happen? Any further reply is stopped by the sounds of idling jet engines. The Hornets are on the ground and parking. They get out of their planes and do their checks. They powwow for a minute and then all 4 come over. Wait, 4 you say? Yeah. These are trainers, 2 new pilots, a new back seat, and a full bird colonel to supervise. They walk up, and the pilot is having visions of getting torn a new one by the long arm of the Canadian law. You boys okay then? Nervous laughter is shared by all, and the colonel says, "Let's have a chat with the tower, eh?" I was thus treated to the very first experience of getting reamed by a staff officer that I've ever seen. The controller failed to pay attention to our relative speed and stacked us way too close together. That officer was not happy, and he let everyone in the building know it. We were excused, shot the breeze with the other pilots for a bit, and continued on to America. Still probably the closest to death that I've ever really been. Story 16. Any thread about pilots and close calls deserves this story. I was flying the SR-71 out of RAF, Millenhall, England, with my backseater, Walt Watson. We were returning from a mission over Europe in the Iron Curtain when we received a radio transmission from home base. As we scooted across Denmark in 3 minutes, we learned that a small RAF base in the English countryside had requested an SR-71 flypass. The Air Cadet commander there was a former Blackbird pilot, and thought it would be a motivating moment for the young lads to see the mighty SR-71 perform a low approach. No problem, we were happy to do it. After a quick aerial refueling over the North Sea, we proceeded to find the small airfield. Walter had a myriad of sophisticated navigation equipment in the back seat, and began to vector me toward the field. Descending to subsonic speeds, we found ourselves over a densely wooded area in a slight haze. Like most former World War II British airfields, the one we were looking for had a small tower and little surrounding infrastructure. Walter told me we were close and that I should be able to see the field, but I saw nothing. Nothing but trees as far as I could see in the haze. We got a little lower, and I pulled the throttles back from 325 knots we were at. With the gear up, anything under 275 was just uncomfortable. Walt said we were practically over the field, yet there was nothing in my windscreen. I banked the jet and started a gentle circling maneuver in hopes of picking up anything that looked like a field. Meanwhile, below, the cadet commander had taken the cadets up on the catwalk of the tower in order to get a prime view of the flypass. It was a quiet, still day with no wind and partial gray overcast. Walter continued to give me indications that the field should be below us, but in the overcast and haze, I couldn't see it. The longer we continued to peer out the window and circle, the slower we got. With our power back, the awaiting cadets heard nothing. I must have had good instructors in my flying career, as something told me I better cross-check the gauges. As I noticed the airspeed indicator slide below 160 knots, my heart stopped and my adrenaline-filled left hand pushed 2 throttles full forward. At this point, we weren't really flying, but were falling in a slight bank. Just at the moment that both afterburners lit with a thunderous roar of flame, and what a joyous feeling that was, the aircraft fell into full view of the shocked observers on the tower. Shattering the still quiet of that morning, they now had 107 feet of fire-breathing titanium in their face as the plane leveled and accelerated, in full burner, on the tower side of the airfield, closer than expected, maintaining what could only be described as some sort of ultimate knife-edge pass. Quickly reaching the field boundary, we proceeded to Mildenhall without incident. We didn't say a word for those next 14 minutes. After landing, our commander greeted us, and we were both certain he was reaching for our wings. Instead, he heartily shook our hands and said the commander had told him it was the greatest SR-71 flypass he had ever seen, especially how we had surprised him with such a precise maneuver that could only be described as breathtaking. He said that some of the cadets' hats were blown off, and the sight of the plan form from the plane in full afterburner dropping right in front of them was unbelievable. Walt and I both understood the concept of breathtaking very well that morning, and sheepishly replied that they were just excited to see our low approach. As we retired to the equipment room to change from spacesuits to flight suits, we just sat there. We hadn't spoken a word since the pass. Finally, Walter looked at me and said, 150 knots. What did you see? Trying to find my voice, I stammered, 152? We sat in silence for a moment. Then Walt said, "Don't ever do that to me again," and I never did. A year later, Walter and I were having lunch in the Mildenhall's Officers Club and overheard an officer talking to some cadets about an SR-71 flypass that he had seen one day. Of course, by now, the story included kids falling off the tower and screaming as the heat of the jet singed their eyebrows. Noticing our habu patches, as we stood there with lunch trays in our hands, he asked us to verify to the cadets that such a thing had occurred. Walt just shook his head and said, it was probably just a routine low approach. They're pretty impressive in that plane. Impressive indeed. Story 17. I'm a pilot, single engine, small aircraft only, but one flight I was a passenger in, the pilots avoided telling us about a disaster until we were about to land. On a flight to Florida, one of the front wheels fell off during takeoff. Luckily, the front of the passenger aircraft had two wheels, side by side, so we weren't doomed. But no passenger knew about the problem until we were 15 minutes from landing in Florida. The pilot told us that the wheel fell off, and we had to do an emergency flyby. They had ambulances and fire trucks lining the runway, and as we landed, we pulled a really long wheelie, keeping the only remaining front tire off the ground as long as possible. Story 18. This doesn't entirely fit the OP's description, as I was still a student pilot at the time, and only my instructor and myself were on board. But while I was doing a random session of instrument training, I had my blinder down. For those of you wondering, this literally means I cannot see out of the windows and can only see down to my instrument panel. My instructor is giving me instructions, and I'm only to rely on the instruments, which also means that he was my only eyes. So if for any reason he saw something he didn't like, he'd say, "My plane," and take control. Well, we were flying along, and he's having me perform various maneuvers with the blinders down to teach me about trusting instruments. At one point, my blinder goggles slip down my nose a smidge, and I catch a quick glance out the side window. About 40 feet off my wing was a skydiver with a parachute open. I immediately whipped my goggles off and screamed, "Skydivers!" And my instructor had no idea. He was my only eyes during my maneuvers, and he had me fly right into the path of skydivers without knowing it. There is a small grass strip nearby that sometimes had skydiving flights in the late summer. Thankfully, he quickly yanked the yoke and flew us out of the immediate area, but it still scared me crapless. Needless to say, he was mortified afterward and kept telling me it, quote, was an accident and he seriously didn't see them. I very well could have killed someone without even knowing it. Gives me the shudders every time I think about it. First of all, glad that there were no casualties here, but also I would love to hear this exact same story told from the perspective of the skydivers. They were probably way more terrified than the dudes in the plane. Story 19. Used to fly a lot as a passenger for work, about 40 flights a year, almost half of those across the Atlantic. Experienced a lot of rough turbulence over the years, but only 2 bad incidents. First one, pretty boring. Pilot decided to fly into a thunderstorm near Kansas City. Saw lightning forking through the clouds right next to the plane. One annoying lady wouldn't stop screaming. Second incident, about 75 to 100 miles south of Greenland, pilot made a sudden dramatic sharp right turn that tipped the contents of a drink cart on someone. To the left of the plane were 2 massive metallic spheres, less than a few hundred yards away, each one about the size of an aircraft carrier. They just sat there in the air at 35,000 feet, had a really shiny, sort of wet appearance. Flight attendants asked everyone to close the shutters. Everyone had seen it through, and what the F's commenced for the next 30 minutes. That was about 8 or 9 years ago, and I still wonder what the hell it was and how close we came to hitting them. Story 20. I went to an aeronautical university. The majority of students were either aerospace engineers or pilots. My boyfriend's an engineer, and our good friend is a pilot. Pilot friend offered to fly the 3 of us out to a large city an hour away. We flew in, ate some Waffle House, and started flying home. My boyfriend was in front, next to the pilot, and I was in the back. We were just coming over some large mountains when the ATCs let us know the winds are crazy strong down on the flight line. Our pilot hadn't been cleared to land, so we flew in circles until we started to run low on fuel. The pilot has one of his instructors on the radio, and they decide he can land, even though he doesn't have that qualification. We prepare for landing. The wind casually bats the plane sideways. We're swaying back and forth by the struggle between wind and pilot. Finally, touch down and land safely. I was taking a nap the whole time. After we land, my friend talked about how scared he was. Story 22. Pilot and controller here. Was an instructor for foreign students for several years, and long story short, we were doing King Air training at night in some pretty hard IFR conditions with a few VIPs in the back. The way larger airplanes work, most checklists are challenge and response oriented, meaning that I say an item on the checklist and dip crap is the one that actually does it. I felt pretty comfortable with this guy. Nice guy, decent English skills, and we'd flown together a few times before, so I wasn't double checking everything that he did. As we were coming in on the ILS approach, I called for approach flaps. Next thing I know, the glide slope goes haywire and my airspeed is deteriorating way faster than it should. We're relatively close to the ground and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. When I look over and see that dip crap put in full landing flaps, 40 degrees, and not approach flaps, 15 degrees if I recall correctly. Instead of going missed approach like I probably should have, I got pretty aggressive with the airplane, pulled the flaps up, and recaptured the glide slope, which typically is a big no-no. Either way, we busted out of the clouds at 300 to 400 feet and landed without incident. After blaming the rough ride on turbulence and seeing the VIPs to their car, I laid into dip crap and told him what he'd done. He's supposed to be scanning the instruments occasionally as backup. He had no idea that he'd A, done anything wrong, and B, we went full deflection on an approach, completely oblivious. TLDR, never trust a foreign pilot. Acronyms. IFR equals Instrument Flight Rules, ILS is Instrument Landing System, designed to take you to within 200 feet of the ground and lined up for the runway. VIP is drunken a-holes in the back of the plane. Story 23. My cousin was a pilot for one of the feeder airlines, descending at night into Pittsburgh during an ice storm when there was a bright flash and explosion right in front of the cockpit. Him and his co-pilot can't see, can't hear. Blind, they increase power and start to climb out. After 10 to 20 seconds, their hearing and vision start coming back. They see the flight instrument spinning randomly. Calmly, they start going through the checklist and reboot the plane. 10 minutes later, they make an uneventful landing. Ground inspection reveals a hole the diameter of a pencil in the nose of the plane, about a foot in front of the windscreen, and another smaller mark on one of the prop blades. Lightning strike. Stories 24. Pilot here. A few years back, I was doing a flight from Dallas to Washington, D.C. This route is very standard and nothing usually goes wrong, assuming the weather is fine. Turns out that on this flight, I had 2 flight attendants who were completely new. This was literally their first flight. Fast forward an hour or so after takeoff and everything is going fine. No unruly passengers that I know of and nothing out of the ordinary. Suddenly, we hit some minor turbulence and one of the 2 new flight attendants starts to lose it. It was as if she had never been on a plane before. She comes into the cabin where I am and starts demanding that I be more careful. She claims that I'm being reckless and that I shouldn't be playing around when her life is on the line. I tried to explain that nothing was wrong and that she was overreacting to nothing, but before I could say anything, she started strangling me from behind and whispered into my ear, "You should have used a serious tag." That moment will haunt my dreams for as long as I live. So, 2 things here. 1, I understand that everyone has to have a first day on the job, so to speak, but why would you put 2 brand new flight attendants on the same flight at the same time for their first ever flight? And secondly, if you're really that paranoid, why would you apply to be a flight attendant? Just saying. Story 25. I'm going to do the typical not a pilot but here, but my dad is a pilot and has some interesting ones. The worst was when he was taking off, or maybe landing, I don't remember too well, from Manchester in a Dan Air charter jet. This was in the days before TCAS was fully implemented. There was a trainee air traffic controller on duty. Whatever caused him to do it, I'm not sure, but he had accidentally sent my dad's plane and a British Midlands jet in a straight course for each other. He got the message on the radio saying, "Descend immediately," and as they do, so the British Midlands jet passed over them. filling up the entire windscreen. I don't think any of the passengers ever really knew what happened at the time due to the fact that it was at the front of the aircraft, but they very nearly collided. There are some other instances where he could nearly have died, but they don't really relate to the question. One of them, however, is that when he worked flying helicopters up in Aberdeen, he was leaving the company and put in a request for extra hours in his last week to get some extra money before he left. However, when the roster came out, he noticed his name wasn't there, and when he inquired, it turns out they'd forgotten to put him on. Anyway, the next week, one of the two helicopters they were operating had a gearbox failure and crashed into the walls. Both pilots and quite a few of the passengers died. If my dad had got his extra roster hours, there would have been a 50% chance of him flying that helicopter. Story 26. Not a pilot. A couple months ago, I was on a flight in a Beech 1900, twin-engine turboprop aircraft that carries 19 passengers, and one of the wheels fell off just after takeoff. One of the other passengers saw it happen and notified the pilot, so emergency services were ready at our destination. Fortunately, the remaining wheel on that side of the aircraft was okay, and we landed without incident. The same day, which happened to be my birthday, I nearly burned the house down, but that's another story. Story 27. It was during training, specifically, at the end of training session, and my instructor and I were returning to the airport. Tower, this is Zulu Kilo Mike, 1600 feet above X, requesting full stop. ZKM, do not enter airspace. Very crowded. Hold over X and wait for clearance. Understood. So I start doing rate 1 turns, 360-degree circles, which take exactly 2 minutes each to do, when all of a sudden we hear over the radio, Tower, this is Delta Kilo, 1600 feet above X, incoming for a full stop. DDK, you may proceed. Forgetting the WTF, hey, I was here first, buddy, I check my instruments and have a thought of, hey, they're at the same place and same altitude as I am. Crap. Keep in mind, I'm turning in circles and can't see exactly in the direction I'm going. What do? Straighten up to have less variability and hope the other plane wasn't expecting you to keep turning? Or keep turning, no visual on where you're turning to, and hope the other plane sees and expects you to keep turning? I opted to keep turning because that's what we were initially doing and didn't want to surprise the other plane. Just as that decision is made, I spot the other plane on my 2. My empennage, tail section, comes within arm's length of his belly, plane gently rocking as the air mass passes. ATC might have had a heart attack at that moment, seeing it on radar. This was before the trainers had PCAS. Anyways, we were so close that it would have been useless and just add to the confusion. We knew who DDK was, so when we finally did land, we did not file a report. My instructor opted for a gentleman's agreement. He went fisticuffs with the pilot by the cool luminance of the Foxlights. You didn't see us. Yes, I did. I didn't hit you. If you saw us, you would have been way further out. Story 28. Not a commercial pilot, but I am a private pilot. I was flying a Cessna 310 just for fun to get a paint job one time. My friend, who is a commercial pilot, was in the right seat working on some things to make me better. So I'm going right along having a great time. Everything's in the green. One passenger in the back, lady who was the owner and was picking the paint color and new interior, and just a beautiful day to fly. I'm scanning the sky just looking for traffic, birds, etc. All of a sudden, directly to my left, a small dot becomes a rapidly increasing and closing aircraft, and I mean fast. He's dead on my altitude and was going to absolutely smash us. I tell my friend and look back and notice that it's an A-10 Warthog. I'm not in an MOA, military operations area, so he shouldn't necessarily be there. I didn't read about any TFRs, I just don't know. Now I think he's going to light us up. My pucker factor went exponential. I absolutely cannot possibly get out of his way. Think sailboat versus speedboat. We're dead. I know it and my friend knows it. The passenger in back is oblivious as she's deciding what color leather should match. We have the cockpit turned off to her, so she can't hear us communicating. Back to the A-10. At the last second, he dives under us. I'm like, crap, we survived and he didn't shoot us or run into us. I think I crushed the yoke with my bare hands. Next thing is, we're watching him climb like a homesick angel. He loops back and pulls right up freaking beside us. It felt like Blue Angel style. I'm thinking that was my warning and he's about to tell us to put this rig on the ground right now. Coolest thing ever happened. I can see him plainly next to me. He opens his face mask, grins a big cheesy grin, gives me a big thumbs up, and then waves his wings at me. Now I've gone from peeing down my leg scare to Top Gun. I put my hand on my aching heart and he laughs at me. He hits the throttle and leaves us. I finally figured out that he'd been seeing us on radar for no telling how long and was probably on a practice intercept of enemy aircraft. I let my friend land the plane at our destination. I was just a bit rattled and he was significantly more experienced. I drove the radios for approach and landing. The funniest thing is the passenger told me I did a great job and would highly recommend me. LOL. She had no idea we almost got shot, had a collision, and got escorted to the ground. But I have a lifetime story to tell. Give me my shades and cue the Top Gun theme, baby. Story 29. I actually have something for this, but there's already over 3,000 comments. Anyway, my dad and his friends were flying in his Piper Cherokee Warrior in the early 80s. They were cruising westbound at night near Atlanta and were on the horn with ATC at Hartsfield-Jackson. The tower assured them that they were clear at their current altitude and heading. They hadn't heard from any other planes in the area where my dad was flying. My dad and his friends were chatting and having a good time when they all feel a sort of low rumbling from their left. Suddenly, massive landing lights come on, shining directly at them. They're so bright, they can feel the heat coming off of them. It's a goddamn C-5A out of nowhere. My dad dives down about 1,000 feet and levels off, then gets back on the horn and asks the tower if they're sure they're clear because they almost got crushed by a cargo plane. Tower comes back with something like, roger that. We're seeing some activity in that area on radar. Maintain heading and altitude. Turns out, military planes sort of do whatever they want and don't really talk to anyone much about it. Or at the very least, that's how this one was. Story 30. Airline pilot here, hence the throwaway. Probably when I had a TCAS resolution advisory on descent into base. Basically, a plane, which was VFR and not talking to air traffic control, was cruising right along a waypoint I was supposed to hit at roughly the same altitude I was supposed to cross the waypoint at. I was also supposed to be slowing down along the descent, so I had power back to flight idle and had started to lower my descent rate to facilitate the crossing restriction, speed, and altitude. Within a few seconds, I got a traffic alert, which means that traffic is in the area. Sadly, this is common in such a busy hub on this point of arrival, and for reasons is never an issue, so it wasn't taken as anything too seriously. Once the resolution advisory kicked in, I immediately disengaged autopilot and pitched up dramatically to avoid the traffic. We got the clear of conflict message shortly after and continued without another hitch. It all happened in a few seconds. I know a few people in the back felt the sudden change in pitch. We had a pilot in the back just riding home. I asked him if he felt it, and he said he slept through it all, so maybe they didn't know too much. Sorry, it wasn't too drastic and terrifying. Something that's probably more interesting, that is. The planes themselves are pretty damn safe with multiple redundancies. I haven't had an engine failure or even anything fail that was anything beyond a minor annoyance. Now, when I was teaching people to fly the Cessnas, I came home with another gray hair almost daily. That was really the scary part of my career. Story 31. Airline pilot. Not sure if this applies because the passengers sure as hell found out. Loud explosive sounds coming from one engine. We know this means an engine stall, but packs don't. We immediately followed the checklist, which states reduce that engine's throttle to below stall threshold and operate the engine at that threshold, approximately 40% power in our case. Cabin fills with smoke, so we turn the pack, air conditioning, and bleed on that engine off. Cabin crew report sparks coming out of that engine. I go and check. Indeed, sparks, but no fire. We turn back for base station. 15 minutes into it, the bangs happen on that side again. We decide to shut down the engine and operate on one engine. Make a nice, smooth landing despite the asymmetrical thrust. Everyone's safe and happy ending. Story 32. Not often. I was on a flight with our squadron as a maintainer, and the primary hydraulics pump decided to shred itself in engine number 2. 3/4 of the fluid was pissing out of the drain mast, and the loadmaster was nervously staring at the engine for about 2 hours. Eventually, I told him that everything was fine because there's a second pump in the engine. The minimum amount of hydraulics was still in the system, and even if that fails, there are 6 other pumps that can take over for that pump. He still checked the engine every 10 minutes. We landed in Tenerife and partied our faces off until the mobile repair team showed up with parts and tools. When we removed the pump, the drive shaft inside the pump was literally falling apart in our hands. It was amazing to see that even though it had destroyed itself, everything was contained in the unit and didn't affect the engine. Edit. The loadmaster constantly looking at the engine led a lot of the passengers to become weary. If he'd just been a professional and listened to the crew, those poor passengers would have been completely clueless. Story 33. I personally witnessed what was very close to a commercial airline collision north of Austin. Not a pilot myself, though. I was driving at a normal range, hitting golf balls, just got off I-35 in the afternoon. There is a small prop plane pulling an advertising banner, roughly following along the north-south route of the highway, at the usual altitude, whatever it is. Then I notice a southwest plane, a 737, coming in from the west towards the highway, perpendicular to it, obviously on the approach flight path to come in for a landing at ABIA. It was happening really slowly, in my mind, but I was mentally tracing the directions of both planes, and it looked like they were going to cross each other's path at the exact wrong moment. I just stared. I may have said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa," or something. Then, when the southwest plane had gotten really close, the prop plane starts rolling its wings side to side, oscillating really fast. It dropped maybe 50 feet. The planes passed each other, the southwest flight passing over the prop plane almost exactly in the same spot. Considering the prop plane was carrying a long banner, well, it was a pretty big target. It was amazing to see the whole thing unfold and then come out okay. Story 34. Airline pilot here as well. About 3,000 hours of commercial flying and also work as a simulator instructor to train other pilots. I don't think disaster is the right choice of word here. Rather, we would like to use what's called a Swiss cheese model. In that model, a series of independent events, such as bad weather, fatigued flight crew, deviation from standard procedures, etc., will create a hole in the cheese. Each of these holes don't necessarily impact the safe outcome of a flight, but when a series of the events link up to create enough passage for light to shine through the cheese, that's where we're in that danger zone. In actual flying on the line, we follow SOPs, standard operation procedures, which is proven to increase safety and facilitate CRM, crew resource management. It's a set of guidelines that we follow religiously to prevent the Swiss cheese model. If we deviate from such, that's when safety standards are not met. In the icebox, simulator training, temp there is usually minus bazillion degrees to keep the systems cool. We train pilots in various scenarios from past incidents and strengthen their skills as a crew. In that training environment, we can throw in many scenarios at once. Fire, loss of engine, V1/V2 cuts, ditching and water, etc., in hopes that even if a potential event happens, the professional crew will systematically process the situation and come up with the best and appropriate action. Then again, there are things that are impossible to come back from, like a series of Murphy's Law shenanigans. Lose an engine, pilot gets ill, first class on fire, and lightning strikes from above at the same time. In those impossible cases, it's like the thumb of God pressing down on you saying, "Buddy, you're out." Jokes aside, it's a profession we all take seriously, and safety is our number one concern. We'll bend over backwards to adhere to SOP, and will not lower our standards to allow close calls. Pilot pals out there, feel free to correct me on anything that I've mentioned that isn't right/current. Typing this on my commute home is actually pretty challenging. Blue skies and tailwinds. Story 35. Airline pilot here. I think the definition of disaster is different between passengers and pilots. An engine failure on takeoff is not a disaster waiting to happen. We practice that in many other scenarios where stuff goes wrong. I've been in some situations where it was uncomfortable and I didn't like it, but there was always an escape plan if we got worse. The system of air traffic control and all the airliners in the sky is good. The systems on the planes themselves are sometimes triple redundant. It's the safest way to travel for good reasons. Story 36. I work in air traffic control on a sector specifically dedicated to aircraft emergencies. I can tell you, aircraft emergencies happen very, very rarely. The most common we see is emergency diversions or emergency priority landings for very sick patients. Most incidents occur on small, privately owned aircraft, which unfortunately happen far more often than commercial aircraft. I can also assure you that if you do become one of the unfortunate that are on an aircraft during an emergency, we're already arranging everything on the ground for every eventuality. Story 37. By far, the most dangerous job in aviation is flight instructing. Little craps will repeatedly try to spin you, crash you, kill you, then argue with you and say they did good. It sucks, and all for $20 an hour. I had one student just let go 15 feet after takeoff and almost put us in a ball at the end of the runway. One tried to stall 30 feet after takeoff. I've had one pull the mixture instead of the throttle back and cruise and kill the engine. I've had one almost taxi in front of a departing aircraft. And the real MVP, a guy tries to push me off the controls and says, "I got it" on landing. Worst effing landing I've ever seen. 1,000 hour private/instrument pilot. Only time I've almost judo chopped someone in the throat while flying. Story 38. Not a pilot, just a PTSD Southwest passenger. Haven't told this story before, so I would like to share it. 2 years ago, was on a 5-hour flight from Washington, D.C. to California. We were about an hour into the flight when I decided it was a good time to take a nap and slowly dozed off. I awakened maybe 15 minutes later to find myself in a panic. Our plane was seemingly spiraling downward, and I was laying against the seat back in front of me. As I turn to the aisle, I see the drink cart and one stewardess going flying by me. It all happened so quick, and all I can think is kind of coming to terms in my head that this was how it was all going to end. I was only 22, and thinking I'm really about to die. Right here, right now, in this stupid effing airplane. Needless to say, our plane soon righted itself after what seemed like being in 10 solid seconds of freefall. This is when people started bursting into tears and collecting themselves. No one was speaking. It was dead quiet, besides sobbing from some women and men. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. The worst part about this whole ordeal is no one, not the pilots, not anyone, said anything for about 40 minutes to an hour. About an hour later, the pilot came on and mumbled some stuff about us being okay and whatnot, but nothing of real significance. This is what probably upset me the most. An event like this and then no one saying anything while all the passengers just sit there in suspense. We flew the rest of the 4-hour flight in quite a lot of turbulence and fear. Luckily, my seatmate, who I didn't know, was really amazing. A businessman who flew a lot, and comforted me about the whole situation. A few weeks later, we all got vouchers from Southwest for free flights and an apology. I was told that we possibly ran across a tailwind of another plane, but no one really ever told us what happened to cause this. I still to this day get intense anxiety when going on flights, in the end. TLDR. Plane spiraled downwards. Didn't die. No one started self-pleasuring. Story 39. Not a pilot, but former Wildland Fire aircraft dispatcher. We had one incident that one of my Type 3, think Aerostar B-2, rotor wings had hit a power line near the highway. I had handed the aircraft off to the air attack, basically air control over an incident. I was getting the reports from our neighboring dispatch because several people called it into them. Checking their AFF position and status, I see they're still green, but showing 0 knots. But it lags behind sometimes. As casually as I could, I inquired with Air Attack as to the status of the aircraft. Very nonchalantly, he informs me they went to refuel, and I had to give him a little more of a push to go check their status right now, as I didn't have commo with them that low in the location. Turned out that they did in fact contact the power line, but the cutters on the nose did their duty and the wire only clipped a rotor. They set down safely and everyone was okay. We also had 3 fatalities on our district, but these aren't for here, I suppose. That job was hard on my stress levels. Story 40. Not an engine pilot, but I know a guy who is. He was flying once, not a jetliner, just a little 3-man thing. Now, about 56 hours into the flight, an oxygen tank exploded due to a fault when trying to turn on a related system. This resulted in losing some hull and the loss of part of the comm system. Everything was still flying though, and turning around wasn't really an option. So they had to just keep on trucking, which meant they wound up having to move into a secondary compartment as the air failed, and wound up jerry-rigging a few air filters to get the CO2 out of the air. Managed to land without further incident though.